The Carter administration began a partial phase-out of lead when Carter was president. But when Reagan came back in, he immediately moved to cripple the environmental regulations and to put an end to that part of the regulations that was getting rid of the lead. But fortunately, it was a bipartisan group of legislators that stood up and spoke to Reagan and fought against Reagan and eventually led to the elimination of lead in gasoline. And as Haidt says, this simple public health intervention worked miracles. Lead levels in children's blood dropped in lockstep with declining levels of lead in gasoline. And the decline in lead in gasoline led to an increase in IQ scores among children, and it led to a decrease in crime, as those kids who grew up, as especially he talks about young men who had been hurt by the lead, acted out and became criminals in our society. He says these young men were eventually replaced by a new generation of young men with unleaded brains, and therefore better impulse control, which led to a drop in crime. It's hard to imagine a better case for government intervention to solve a national health problem. And yet their moral narrative kept them from seeing that this was just such an obvious, a no-brainer in terms of the health of people. That's their blind spot, one of their blind spots. Liberals also have blind spots. We hate the idea of exclusion. He gives an example of a talk he gave once to a bunch of graduate students where he was talking about the benefit of religious organizations. And a graduate student was appalled and she said that religions are exclusive. They don't accept everyone. And he said, I asked her what she meant, and she replied, well, the Catholic Church won't accept anyone who doesn't believe its teachings. And he says, I couldn't believe that she was serious. He said, I asked her how many students were graduate students with her, and how did they get into graduate school? He said, I pointed out to her that she was in one of the most exclusive clubs in the world as a graduate student. Of course, she was concerned about exclusion of gays and others in religious communities. He goes on to say that comments such as these convince me that John Lennon captured the common liberal dream in his song, a song that we sing here occasionally, one of my favorites. Imagine if there were no countries and no religion too. I mean, that's kind of the liberal dream. If we could just erase all the borders and all the boundaries that divide us, then the world would be as one. It's a vision of heaven for liberals, and it's a vision of hell for conservatives. And he says, and I actually tend to agree, the conservatives are on to something in that. And that is because it's in those groups, wherever they are found, that we all develop what social scientists called moral capital. Robert Putnam in Bullying Alone talked about the same thing. It's in groups, loyal groups that have boundaries, where we learn to work for part of a larger goal that is bigger than ourselves. We learn about teamwork, we learn about loyalty, we learn about sacrifice, we learn about trust. And these are the kind of virtues that are critical for any healthy society. Now, those groups include churches, civic organizations, sports teams, fraternities, unions, the military, education systems. And every group is by definition exclusive. And that's a feature, not a bug. Because you have to work hard to get into it, or you have to learn something to get into it, or you have to contribute and volunteer to get into it. You have to make a sacrifice to be a part of it. You learn to give up something of yourself in order to be part of the group. And not everyone can participate. And it's true that any group can become insular, and any group can become demonic. And trust me, I know. An incredibly painful example of that for me is what has come to light recently at Penn State with the football team and the program as an alumni there. Just back in Pennsylvania, and it's incredible back there. It's the pain and the hurt and some denial as well. And so groups need checks, and they need transparency. But still, we need groups. We need more groups, not less. Anything that binds people together into dense networks of trust makes people less selfish. Liberals operating out of a moral narrative that stands up for victims of oppression and exclusion, wanting to break down barriers of exclusion, often fail to see the unintended consequences of their actions when they work in society to do that. An example of that that he gives is the urge to help the inner city poor that led to welfare programs in the 1960s. It was a noble goal, it is a noble goal, to want to end poverty and to use the resources of a government to do something about that. But virtually everyone who looked at the situation, and especially social scientists from all stripes who study it, agree that there were strong black families, strong black churches, strong black civic organizations that were, however they were not able to keep up, nevertheless were there and were doing what they could to address the poverty and the trouble that was there. And that the welfare programs that were instituted as they were instituted, I got to yell a little louder, contributed to the breakdown of those and those churches and those civic organizations. And so the unintended consequences of that intervention were enormous and continue to be enormous. And so we have some blind spots too. We tend to think that if we can just have a great big program to fix things, and I'm for great big programs to fix things, like healthcare, that will fix things. But we often fail to see the unintended consequences that come along because of that. And so the larger point here today is that we can't see our own blind spots. We need other people who have a different perspective to be able to see those blind spots. And if we get into the culture war mentality where we demonize those other people and we won't even speak to them because they're evil and they're wrong and they're degraded and they're not evolved, then we get insular. And we get more convinced that we're right and that we just need to keep forcing through our own programs. And I think we need to ratchet down the culture wars and try and create opportunities to sit down with those who differ from us and actually try to listen. And listen to their moral narratives and see if we can identify those pieces of the moral narratives that we might, even if we don't share that moral narrative, agree that there's something to them, like tradition. And this is the place. I mean, this is the kind of place where that kind of thing should be happening in the church. And I think as we move through into the fall and think about programming in the fall, that it's my hope that we can begin to think about some ways that we can have some of those intentional conversations because it especially pains me greatly to go to church events and see exactly what's happening out in the politics, ripping people apart in the churches. We've got to be better. So, thank you for listening. Amen.